It's episode 400 of the Church Solutions podcast. My name is Phil Thompson. I'm with you today, flying solo. Well, not exactly solo. We have a guest, which I will introduce here in a moment. Steve Lacy is out, but I can't believe we've got over 400 episodes now. We've actually got more than 400 podcast episodes, but that's when we start counting. But anyhow, we're glad that you are here today with us. Thanks so much for spending a little bit of time with us. We've got a great guest today. And one of my favorite topics that we're going to discuss is change. And we'll get to that in a moment. I do want to remind you that, we're a streaming company. We do a lot of tech stuff, but because we're involved in ministry, we cover a lot of different topics. Today's not necessarily tech at all, but that's an example of some of the things we do. We do also webinars. And if you're interested, we have a webinar coming up in October. So if you're listening to this before October 17th, you might want to sign up for it. It's free. It is called Unlock. Let me put my glasses on so I can read the title. Unlock your free Christmas promotion toolkit. Unlock your free Christmas promotion toolkit. One of our shorter titles, by the way, and it's going to be happening October 17th. It's 9 on the West Coast, 12 on the East Coast, and this is a great little webinar that we'll probably do some follow-ups on as well. And it's all about helping you reach your people and reach more people during the Christmas season. And Christmas, yes, is coming up. And it's a great time to reach people, as historically we know that people that don't normally come to church, or at least go back to church, will do that around the Christmas season and around Easter. So we got some great tools here that could probably help your church and ministry, and it's all free. So again, it's you can sign up for this webinar.streamingchurch.tv. And sign up for that. It's free, and I think you'll like it. All right, so our next guest has been a pastor for really over 20 years. He's been helping churches navigate a changing world, and he's also the host of the Spiritual Life and Leadership podcast. And that podcast helps leaders integrate their inner spiritual life with their outer life of leadership and ministry. He's also author of the book Beyond Thingification. I didn't mispronounce that, or maybe I did, but it's Thingification. We'll get to that in a moment. Helping your church engage in God's mission. Please welcome everybody, Markus Watson, to the Church Solutions podcast. Markus, how are you today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to talk with you today.
Yeah, we're happy about this. And you're in the San Diego area, one of my favorite spots. Yep. And I need to come out and visit you sometime because we go out there quite often.
Awesome. That'd be great.
Which maybe after the podcast you won't want to, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So Markus, change. Boy, I tell you, change is, in my experience, it's one of the hardest things for people to navigate. I mean, I was in ministry for over 4 decades, and I was also in leadership, and boy, that's tough. But it's also tough on the people. It's tough on the leader. I've really recent years really embraced the principles of impermanence, which has really helped me navigate change. But change is a difficult thing, and especially if you're leading a church, because as we know, most people don't like change. So let me start off by asking you a couple of questions. What are some of the biggest challenges that pastors face when trying to lead change in their churches?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it is ubiquitous, right? I mean, is everywhere. Everyone is having to lead change, especially, I would say, sort of in this post-COVID world where the church is not what it was even 3, 4, 5 years ago. I read recently, Tom Rainer said something about, he had a little article about the fact that we need to recategorize our church sizes, where it used to be a small church was if you were under 150. I'm making that number up, but now he says if you're 50 and below, you're a small church. If you're 51 to 100, you're a mid-sized church. If you're 101 to 250, you're a large church. And if you're over 250, then you're a very large church. And then, of course, you've got mega church as well, right? So I mentioned that as a way of saying this is one of the changes that we have to sort of wrestle with, is just sort of a new normal, right? This is what we might call adaptive change. And so for me, one of the things that's really helpful is distinguishing between technical change and adaptive change. And this language comes from the work of Ronald Heifetz, who's written great books like Leadership on the Line, where he's a Harvard professor, leadership guy. Technical change is the kind of change that for which we have experts, right? So some of the changes that happened, for instance, during COVID, was we had to implement, streaming services. Well, there were experts who knew how to do that. So in some regards, it was a technical change. But on the other hand, it changed the way we thought about church, right? So because church is something that we do together, and it's about fellowship, and it's about community, it's about communal worship, and hearing God's word together. And all of a sudden, we're having to rethink what we mean by church, and can we still be a church if we're not in the same place? So that would fit more into the category of an adaptive change in terms of sort of the emotional change. So anyway, that's the challenge when it comes to change. And I think the hardest thing about change, especially when it comes to adaptive change, is that change always means, that's why I think people really don't like the new thing. It's because they're going to potentially lose something that's very meaningful to them. Sometimes I think about the worship wars, that we had back in like the 80s and 90s, and and the resistance there was to introducing sort of more contemporary music. And looking back now, I'm like, oh, it's not so much that people resisted the new form of music, it's that they were afraid of losing a kind of worship that was very meaningful to them, with which they grew up, and that holds a lot of powerful and beautiful memories for them. And to lose that, right, that's what they were resisting. It wasn't necessarily that they were resisting the new thing, it's that they were resisting losing the thing that had meant so much for them. Anyway, so that's kind of my thoughts, initial thoughts anyway, on change and why it's so hard and why it matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's some very good points. So let's talk about some common mistakes here that pastors make when trying to lead change. So, let's say, I don't know, maybe you've come into a congregation, you're new to the congregation, and you want to, there's some things you want to make a change on. What are some common mistakes that we make?
Well, that's a great question too. I think one of the biggest mistakes we make is coming in as though we are the expert, especially if you're coming into a new church. One of the things I've learned, and I've served in several churches, every church is different, right? They have a different character. They're different people with different interests and passions. There's a different history. There's a different neighborhood, right? Different culture. And I think one of the mistakes we make is that we come in saying, well, this is what worked at my last church and it's going to work now, right? And so you come in and you say, here are the answers. Or sometimes maybe the mistake we make is I've read all these books and I'm just going to apply these books, what I've learned from these books, just as is, without sort of contextualizing to that particular church, right? I mean, I've learned a lot from books, right? I've learned a lot from my experiences in other churches, but the thing that I need to do every time I go into a new congregation is I need to just start by listening. And I actually need to start by not changing anything at first. Because I don't know yet, right, what needs to change and what doesn't need to change. I might have some ideas. So for instance, this is kind of a funny example. I worked for a few years at a tiny little church. I was an interim pastor, about 2 hours east of San Diego. You would drive through there, Phil, on your way to San Diego, the Imperial Valley, and a little town called Westmoreland, and a little church made up mostly of farmers and other people who work in agriculture, because that's the industry there. And they ended the service with sort of a song. They would gather around in a circle, hold hands, and sing sort of a blessing to the tune of Edelweiss. and totally hokey in any other context. And I thought about it often. I was like, I would never introduce this, to any church that I served, but it worked in that congregation. For those people, it was a really meaningful experience. And so I was like, I'm not touching that, right? I am leaving that just as is. Now, if they ever say, maybe we'll stop doing that, that's fine. We can have that conversation, and maybe that's the right thing to do. But it's not my job to go in there and start flipping tables, so to speak.
Wow.
Jesus got to do that. I didn't get to do that. Until the time comes that I've earned some credibility, perhaps. We've had lots of conversations. I'll give another example of leading change. One of my churches, it was sort of a worship wars issue. This was back in the mid 2000s, and do we combine our traditional service and our contemporary service, because attendance was on the decline? And so what we did was we got everyone together, the whole congregation. I put them around tables in our fellowship hall, and I gave them several questions to discuss. And basically, the questions were just questions like, how do you feel about the way things are right now, in terms of having two services? How would you feel about combining the two services? Would you, what feelings are brought up for you? Anyway, so those kinds of questions, and I just let them discuss. I had a facilitator and a note taker at each table. And I said, everybody gets to share, right? Everybody has to share. You have to say something. So everybody got a voice. And then after, I gave them maybe 20 minutes or so to talk at their tables. And then I said, okay, now I want each table to, designate someone to come up and share what you discussed at your table. And then they shared that with the whole congregation that was gathered there in that room. And it was so good because everybody's voice was heard. And here's the thing. I didn't have enough authority to, like expert authority, or even, what's the word? Just not political authority, but what I mean? Just relational authority with the people, because I hadn't quite been there long enough yet. However, Jack Hyde, a guy in his 70s or 80s, had a lot of authority in that congregation. And so he came up and he came to share for his table. And he said, the world is changing and I don't like it. And I wish we could go back to the 1970s. And I thought to myself, oh no, I can't believe he's saying this. And then he goes, but we can't. And he said, so it's not a matter of if we change, it's when we change. And I say, when is now? And that's what clinched it, right? It wasn't anything I did. It was what Jack did. But what I did was I created an environment in which those conversations could happen, and in which someone like Jack could get up and say that to the whole congregation. Because when he said it, everyone goes, oh yeah, he's right. Right.
Yeah.
Those are go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm guilty as charged, as you were saying at the beginning there. I would go in the churches either as a senior pastor or executive pastor and, overturn tables, try to force change, come off cocky. And it didn't get me very far at all. And so what you're sharing is a lot of wisdom, and really you're answering my next question. You already really answered it. Was, well, what are some things that pastors can do to create a culture of change? And so that's definitely one of them right there. Being open to what the people have to say and helping create that culture. Can you elaborate a little bit more on culture?
Yep, for sure. So what I've said so far is listening, conversations. Another way that's helpful to think about leading change is a process that is referred to sometimes as action reflection. This is sort of a technical term, but the idea is you take action together. So let's say, so this is an example from my book. This is kind of what I talk about in my book. So if you're trying to reach your neighborhood and your church is not very good at reaching your neighborhood, well, what can we do, right? How do we do that? How do we actually connect with neighbors? An action reflection process is a process in which you do something, you try something out, and then you sit back and you reflect on it, and you kind of say, how did that go? What did we learn? What are we seeing? What is God saying in the midst of this? So the way this would look is, let's say you get a group of people in your church together, um, 6, 10 people, something like that, 12 people max maybe, and you just say, let's start paying attention to the people that we interact with in our neighborhoods, and maybe pick a particular place that you're involved in. So maybe your kids are on the Little League team, and so you just start paying attention, you have conversations, you ask questions from the other parents, as you're just pay attention as you're with other people, and just notice, what are their hopes, what are their fears, what are their anxieties, what are they longing for, what are they excited about, and just pay attention. So it could be a Little League team, could be a PTA, group, could be, when we did this in one of my churches, she was in an investment club, and so that was her place where she was just going to pay attention, right? So that's sort of the action part. You go into your neighborhood, you take action, in this case by listening, by paying attention. And then we would come together once a month, and then we would reflect together. And what that meant is we would spend some time in prayer. We would spend some time in the scriptures, sort of listening to the story of God. And then we would listen to each other's stories. What did we notice? What did we hear? What kinds of conversations did we have when we were out in the neighborhood, right? And we talked about that. We took notes. And then we went back out again, right, for a month, and spent time just listening to our neighbors again. We kind of did this action reflection process for several months, and then several months, meaning maybe like 6 to 8 months. So it's not a short process, right? If you're leading change, actual change, it's not going to happen quick, because if it happens quick, there's going to be resistance, right? And so if you're going to lead people along in a process of change, it has to take some time. But then you get to a point where you've done this action and reflection, you've paid attention, you've thought about it, you've prayed about it, and then you can say, now let's try something, right? Let's do an experiment. And that just means, listen, we've learned from our neighbors, and maybe if we do this will meet a need in our community, and not just any old need, but a need that is reflective of who we are as followers of Jesus, right? So ministry, kind of a engagement, but also, how are we wired as a church? We've probably talked about this in our times of reflection. What are our gifts? What are we good at? And then again, what does the neighborhood need? And maybe we can engage like this, and so maybe we volunteer at the tutoring center, and that becomes a ministry experiment, and maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. Maybe if you're in a college town, let's on Friday nights, we'll put up a stand and give out free hot dogs and water to try to keep the kids sober or something. But, so you just try things, right? And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But here's the thing. If it's an experiment, then it can't fail, right? It is, even if it doesn't work, it's not a failure. It just means, okay, we tried that and we learned that thing didn't work. So then let's reflect again. Let's kind of think about what worked, what didn't. And then you can try something else, right? So you experiment again. And when one church, actually this church in Westmoreland, they kind of went through a process like that, where I was not their pastor yet. I was actually guest preaching with them a couple of times a month. They were without a pastor at the time. And I met with their elders after church once, and they wanted to just pick my brain on some thoughts. And I was asking them, what do you guys do besides worship on Sunday mornings? Again, tiny church, tiny town. And I said, and they're very anxious about their Sunday attendance. And I was like, you guys have a nice campus. It's small, but it's clean, what do you guys do besides Sunday mornings? And they're like, oh, no, nothing actually. And I was like, well, what else could you do? Right. And sometimes all you got to do is ask the question, right? And that gets people thinking. And that's what happened in this case. So, one of the ladies in particular, who's kind of a go-getter, and sometimes that's part of the makeup of the church. You got someone who really takes action. She's like, well, let's try some stuff. And so they tried like a health fair for their neighborhood, and it was good, but it wasn't like it. And I think they tried one or two other things, but then they said, let's try a food pantry. And that was a little bit more of an investment, or in terms of their engagement and raising some money. But it came after trying a few things and kind of getting a sense of what they can and can't do. And when they started that food pantry, that was it, right? And so they've been, and this is a town with a lot of food insecurity. There's something like 16% food insecurity in this town, maybe even higher than that. And so they've been doing this food pantry now for, gosh, I think about 5 years. And every Thursday night, 100 to 200 families come through and receive a box full of food. And what's amazing is, right, when it works, when you know that God is in it, it happens. Funding has always been there. And what's really cool in this case, right, it has brought life to that church, because now the whole church, even if they aren't, it's an elderly congregation, not everybody can volunteer on Thursday nights, but a lot of them do. It's like, it's not just about our Sunday morning attendance. It's also about what are we doing on Thursday nights and how many people are we serving Thursday night? And that gives life to the church. All of a sudden, the church realizes, oh, we actually matter in this community, right? Mm-hmm. And if we ceased to exist, that's the age-old question. If your church ceased to exist, would anybody in your neighborhood notice, right?
Right.
Well, now their neighborhood would notice, right? And I love that the lady who started this was kind of the driving force, and still is in a lot of ways sort of the leader of this. She said, I love that the people that we're serving are becoming our friends, right? So that kind of outreach is just beautiful, right? Yeah. And some even, right, come to church. It's not the goal necessarily. We're not going to try to get people to come on Sunday mornings. They're welcome to. But the goal is just, we want to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this community, and this is how we're doing it. So anyway, right, an example of change through action, reflection, trying some things, stepping back. Did this work? Didn't work? And let's keep trying things until we find the thing that matters. Yeah.
And you really created that culture for that to thrive. And I do like that quote about, we don't make mistakes, we just have experiments that maybe didn't work. So I got more questions here. We're starting to run out of time, but you mentioned your book here. You made a quick reference to the book Beyond Thingification, helping your church engage in God's mission. So first of all, is thingification a word? I don't think it is it?
Well, it may or may not be. I actually did get the word from another book called Sharing Faith by Thomas Groom. And it's kind of an academic book, but it's all about how does spiritual formation through Christian education happen. And that's where I got the word, but I think he actually got the word from Martin Luther King Jr. And so the idea is, the reason I call it that is, I think in a lot of ways, we pastors and leaders tend to thingify people in our churches and in our communities. What I mean by that is, we forget that they are people, and we tend to think of them as categories, giving units, right? It's not intentional, right? It's not like we're trying to dehumanize people, but in some subtle ways, we have this tendency of dehumanizing. And so we often think in terms of, how do we get people ram them through a process to get them to where they can volunteer in our church and maybe even lead certain ministries. But it's almost, it's almost like we forget who they are and their needs and their stories. And then we do the same thing with our neighborhoods. It's like, so as a pastor, sometimes I get sucked into the thought pattern of thinking, people in my church exist to serve the church, and people outside the church exist to start coming to our church, right? And so that's kind of what I mean by thingification. We tend to think of people more as these categories rather than as human beings created in the image of God, with their own stories and needs and hopes. And the way that fits then into kind of what I was just talking about, is I think what we need to do when we engage in our communities is to humanize everyone, right? Both those in our church, as we engage in sort of an action reflection process. What that does is it allows us to process all of even our feelings, our fears, our hopes as people in the church wanting to reach our community. But then also as we engage the community, we are humanizing, right? The people outside our community by really listening to them. So I think the danger sometimes is that we've read a book, or we've gone to seminary or gotten a certificate or whatever, and now we know what our neighborhood needs, right? But we probably don't. If we
Right.
have not been paying attention to the actual people who live in our neighborhood, we probably have no idea what they need. We think they need, I don't know, tutoring, but maybe what they need is Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know, right? But
Right.
you don't know that until you pay attention. So that's kind of the idea behind going beyond thingification, is we want to really pay attention to the people in our church, outside our church, and in that way engage in the mission that God has for our church, to our community.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we're starting to run out of time here, but you've got a project coming up, or you tell us a little bit about what's new with you and what you got going.
Yeah. So I've got an online course that is free. I just created it. It's called Becoming Leaders of Shalom, and the reason I wanted to put this out there, I think shalom is one of my new favorite words of the last few years. It's a word that it's a Hebrew word, means peace, but it's much more than that. It's really about a comprehensive state of well-being, right, that touches every aspect of life. And I think that that's what God wants for the world. That's why every kind of ministry matters. Ministry, in poverty-stricken areas, ministry in terms of relational healing or marriage ministries, family ministries, but also evangelism kinds of ministries, right? Because that's reconciliation with God. That's shalom between us and God. And so how do we become the kinds of leaders who lead our people to be people of shalom in the world, right? To be shalom bringers, so to speak, into the world. That everywhere we go, we are bringing the well-being that God wants for the world. How do we become leaders who can lead our churches in that way? But then also, we are called to lead from a place of our own inner shalom, right? Our own inner wholeness, because we have been made whole, right, by God, by Jesus, and secure in who we are as God's beloved, and not needing to meet people's approval or get people's approval or fear, anxiety over, am I doing the right thing? And are people going to criticize me, or, those kinds of things. And so how do we lead from a place of wholeness and health and security and confidence? That's part of becoming a leader shalom. So anyway, it's a 12-day online course. It's available now. You can go get it at markuswatson.com/leaders of shalom. My name, by the way, is spelled with a K. So it's MARKUS Watson.com/leaders of shalom. You can sign up there. It'll start coming in your inbox, 1 lesson per day. It's about 2 hours total of content. You'll get it over 12 days. And I invite folks to go check that out.
Super. MarkusWatson.com that's your main website address.
That's right.
And again, it's MARKUS Watson, all one word.com. Super. All right. Yep. Well, good deal. Look, we're out of time here, but this has been great. And sure appreciate what you're doing. And I want to make a friend with you. So when I come out to San Diego, I can visit you and say hi. And we definitely need to have you back on the Church Solutions podcast again sometime soon. We would love to do that.
Absolutely. Would love to. Yeah.
All right. And so, folks, if you want to get a hold of Markus, you're available. If somebody goes to your website, there's a way lots
of information there. And if they want to email me, Markus@markuswatson.com, if they want to reach out to me that way. Yeah,
that's good. And as always, we're available. If you missed all that or something, you're driving down the road and whatever, just reach out to us here at streamingchurch.tv. We have chat and all that good stuff there. We really want to help churches. Besides doing technical stuff with ministry, we want to help them with resources, and we have some great people here, and that's part of what we do here at the Church Solutions Podcast. So Markus, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Love being with you.
All right, good deal. And on behalf of Steve Lacy, who's not here today, he'll be back next time. I'm Phil Thompson. Catch us on another episode of the Church Solutions Podcast. Please take care of yourselves and each other.